I just settled on the kitchen table and walked away. That's all I did. I didn't say anything. I didn't wrap it, didn't put a bow on it, didn't even wipe the clay dust off my hands before I came inside. It was a painting, 24 by 36 inches, oil on linen, a landscape of the creek behind my mother's house in rural Tennessee, where my husband and I had our first real conversation. 17 years ago, I'd worked on it for 4 months, squeezing in hours after my daughter went to bed, setting up my easel in the corner of the garage where the light was terrible and the floor was cold. He looked at it for maybe 3 seconds. Is this supposed to be something? I told him it was the creek. Our creek. He nodded slowly, the way he nods when he's pretending to process something he's already dismissed. Then he said, I just don't think it looks like much, honestly. It looks like something you'd find at a yard sale. He picked up his phone and walked out of the kitchen. My daughter was sitting at the counter. She was 16 and she had his eyes and his way of making you feel small without raising her voice. She looked at the painting and then at me and said, He's right, Mum. It kind of looks like something a kid made. Then she added, Haverford's mom does watercolors and she actually takes classes. You should maybe do that, get some real instruction. Haverford was her boyfriend. I didn't know his mum. I didn't say any of that. I took the painting back to the garage. I leaned it against the wall behind a box of holiday decorations where I wouldn't have to look at it. I stood there in the cold for a while with my hands in my sweatshirt pocket, and I thought, maybe they're right. Maybe I've been wasting time in here when I could have been doing something useful. My husband was a civil engineer. He made good money. He was practical and precise, and he thought in structures and load tolerances, and I was in the garage painting creeks by the light of a clip-on lamp like some kind of... I didn't finish that thought. I turned off the lamp and went inside. That was 3 years ago. I should back up. I grew up painting. My mother was a textile artist. She had a studio in the back of our house and it always smelled like linseed oil and turpentine. And on weekends, she would let me sit beside her and mix colors on her palette while she worked. She wasn't famous. She never made much money from it. But she made things that were real, things that held light in a particular way, and people who saw her work always stopped. She taught me that you don't paint to impress anyone. You paint because you have to, because if you don't, the thing inside you that wants to make it gets backed up and strange and starts to leak out sideways. I stopped painting when I got married. Not on purpose, not because he asked me to. It just happened. The way things happen when you're managing a household and a child and a husband who works 60 hours a week and expects dinner to be a real meal, not something assembled. I went back to it 6 years in, not because anything dramatic happened, but because my daughter started first grade, and I found myself standing in the kitchen at 9:15 in the morning with nothing to do, and the feeling was so unfamiliar it scared me. I bought a small canvas and some oil paints from the craft store in town. Not good paints, student grade, the kind that go on chalky and fight the brush. I set up in the garage because there was nowhere else, and I painted the view out the window, which was just the side of the neighbor's fence and the strip of dead grass. It was not a good painting, but something happened while I made it. Something I hadn't felt in years. Something like being returned to myself. I kept going. Every day, after the school drop-off, for 2 hours. I got better paints. I stretched my own canvases. I read everything I could about technique, underpainting, glazing, the way the Flemish masters built up color in layers so thin you can't see them individually, only the cumulative effect of light passing through. I wasn't formally trained, but I was serious. There's a difference. My husband thought it was a hobby. He was polite about it for a while. He'd say things like, "That's nice," when I showed him something, the same way you'd respond to a child showing you their drawing. Over time, he stopped saying even that. The garage became a place I went to do my thing, the way some wives go to yoga or join book clubs. Fine, harmless, not worth discussing. The painting I gave him for our anniversary was the best thing I'd made. I knew it when I finished it. I'd used a technique I'd spent months developing, a particular way of building up the underpainting in raw umber and then glazing over with color in layers, so the finished surface had a depth to it, a luminosity that made it look lit from inside. The creek in it caught the late afternoon light the way I remembered it. The way it actually looked on the evening he sat beside me on the bank and told me he loved me for the first time. I thought it might mean something to him. It did not mean something to him. After I put the painting behind the holiday boxes, I went back to making smaller things. Landscapes, still lifes, a series of interiors, chairs in empty rooms, windows with curtains moving. I stopped showing my husband. I stopped asking my daughter to look. The garage was mine, and I stopped pretending it was something we shared. The call came on a Tuesday in November. I almost didn't answer because the number was a 212A code and I assumed it was a spam call. But something made me pick up. I was sitting in the garage eating lunch alone while a half-finished painting of the backyard in October dried on the easel, and I had nothing to lose by answering. The woman on the other end of the line introduced herself as the director of a gallery in Manhattan. A real gallery. One I knew, one I had walked past on a trip to New York years ago and stood outside for a long time looking at the name on the glass. She said she'd come across my work. I said, "I'm sorry, how?" She said a friend of hers had seen a painting I'd sold through an online platform 18 months earlier. A small one, a study of light through a kitchen window, which I'd listed for $280 because I didn't know what else to do with it. The friend had photographed it and sent it to her. She'd been trying to track me down for 4 months. She said she wanted to include 3 of my pieces in a group show the following March. She said the other artists in the show were names I recognized from auction catalogs, from museum collections. She said, "Your work has something that's very hard to find right now. There's a quietness to it, but there's also enormous pressure underneath, like something held very still." I sat in the cold garage with the phone against my ear, and I didn't say anything for what was probably too long. She said, "Are you still there?" I said, "Yes, I'm here. Yes. Of course, yes." I didn't tell my husband right away. I held it for almost 2 weeks, carrying it around the house like something I wasn't sure was real, checking my email every morning to make sure her messages were still there. I told my mother. She cried. I told my best friend from college, who drove to my house on a Thursday night with a bottle of wine and made me read her the emails out loud, both of us sitting on the kitchen floor. I told my husband on a Saturday morning, over coffee. I tried to say it simply, without drama. I showed him the gallery's website on my phone. I said that 3 of my paintings would be included in a show on the Upper East Side in March. He looked at the screen for a moment. Then he said, "How much does it cost to be in something like this?" I said it didn't cost anything. They were representing me. They would handle framing and shipping and installation. He said, Then he said, "Well, hopefully it's fun for you. Don't let it take over your schedule." He went back to his coffee. My daughter was at the counter doing homework. She hadn't looked up. I picked up my phone and went back to the garage. I decided to give them the anniversary painting. It was the best thing I had, and I knew it. I'd pulled it out from behind the holiday boxes after the phone call, carried it into the light and looked at it for a long time, and I knew it was better than anything I'd made since. I shipped it along with 2 others, an interior with morning light coming through a half-open door, and a large landscape of winter fields in grey and violet. I drove to New York with my college friend because I didn't want to make that drive alone. We stayed in a hotel 2 blocks from the gallery, and on the opening night, we wore our nicest dresses and walked over together in the cold. The gallery was everything I'd imagined it would be. White walls, perfect light, the kind of quiet that makes you speak in a lower voice. My 3 paintings were hung together in a room toward the back, and I stood in the doorway and looked at them for a long time before I went in. The anniversary painting was the largest, under the gallery lights, with proper framing and the right distance to stand back and see it whole. It looked, I don't know how to say this without sounding arrogant, it looked like it belonged. The creek caught the light the way I'd intended, and the whole surface had that particular luminosity I'd spent months learning to create. A woman I didn't know was standing in front of it with a glass of wine, not moving, just looking. I watched her stand there for 6 minutes. I counted. The gallery director found me later in the evening and touched my arm and said, The creek at dusk has a bid on it. I said, already? She said, 2 bids actually. It's going to a sealed auction. My husband came to the opening. I hadn't asked him to, and he hadn't said he was coming. He appeared in the doorway of the gallery at 8:15 in the evening in his good wool coat, and he stood there for a moment scanning the room until he found me. I walked over. He looked around the space slowly, the way he looks at a construction project, assessing, cataloguing. He said, "It's a nice place." I said, "Thank you for coming." He walked with me toward the back room. He stopped in the doorway when he saw my paintings, and he stood very still. I watched him look at the creek painting the way he had never looked at it in the kitchen, the way he had never looked at anything I made. The woman with the wine glass was gone, but another couple had taken her place, speaking quietly to each other and pointing at the surface, at the way the light pooled in the lower left corner. My husband didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "That's the one you gave me." I said, "Yes." He said, "I didn't know you could," and then he stopped. I waited. He didn't finish the sentence. My daughter came with him. She was 17 now, and she stood with her arms crossed in the way she does when she's trying not to be affected by something. She looked at the painting. Then she looked at the couple looking at the painting. Then she looked at the discreet card on the wall beside it with my name and the title and the note that said, "Under consideration for a Sitorkin." She said, "Mom." I said, "Yeah?" She said, "This is really good." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Like, actually really good." I said, "I know." We stood there together for a moment. She uncrossed her arms. She said quietly so her father wouldn't hear across the room, "I'm sorry for what I said when you showed it to him. What I said about the yard sale thing." She was looking at the painting, not at me. That was mean. I was just going along with what he said and I shouldn't have. I said, "You were 14. She said, 16. I said, "I know. I still forgive you." She leaned her head against my shoulder for just a second. Then she straightened up and moved away, and I pretended not to notice because she needed me to. The sealed bid closed 10 days after the opening. The Creek at Dusk sold for $182,000. I was in the garage when the director called. I was working on something new. A painting I'd started the morning after the opening. Loose and fast. Nothing I planned to show anyone. Just paint on canvas to see what happened. I answered the phone with a brush in my hand. She read me the number and I sat down on the floor. She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I just need a minute." She said, "Take all the time you need. You should know the buyer specifically asked about representation rights. They want more of your work." I sat on the cold concrete floor of my garage, the floor I had been sitting on for 6 years in the cold, and I looked at the painting drying on the easel, the one that had no plan, no technique, just the need to make something, and I thought about my mother in her studio with the turpentine smell. And I thought about the woman with the wine glass who stood in front of my painting for 6 minutes, not moving. And I thought about the things you make in the dark that turn out to be real. I moved out 3 months later. Not because of the money, or not only because of the money. The money made things possible that hadn't been possible before. That's honest. But I'd known for a long time, longer than I'd admitted to myself, that I was living inside a version of my life that didn't match who I was anymore, maybe never had. The painting money was like a key that was already in my hand. I just finally used it. My husband was not cruel about it. He was confused in a way that was harder, actually, than cruelty would have been. He kept saying, "I don't understand what changed." I didn't know how to tell him that nothing changed, that I'd been this person the whole time. The whole time he was calling my work something you'd find at a yard sale. The whole time I was in the garage alone in the cold, making things he never looked at. Nothing changed. I just stopped agreeing that it didn't matter. I found an apartment with good north light and high ceilings. I set up a real studio, not a corner of a garage, but an actual room. Walls I could hang things on, proper storage for canvases, a space heater that worked. The first morning I painted there, the light came through the windows at an angle I hadn't expected and landed on the drop cloth on the floor in a way that was almost unbearable. It was so good. I stood and looked at it for a while before I picked up a brush. My daughter came on weekends. The first time she walked into the studio, she stopped in the doorway and looked at everything: the paintings on the walls, the organized palette, the stacks of stretched linen against the baseboards. And then she came in and sat in the corner chair I'd put there for her, and she said, "Can I watch you work?" I said yes. We didn't talk much that afternoon. I painted and she watched, sometimes reading, sometimes just sitting. At one point she said, "How do you know what color to mix?" I said, "You look at what you're seeing and then you look at what you've got on the palette and you try to get them closer to each other. You're never going to match it exactly. You're just trying to get closer." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Can you teach me?" I said, "I've been waiting for you to ask." I handed her a brush. I've thought about that moment a lot. Him standing in the doorway of that back room, looking at the crepe painting under the gallery lights, starting a sentence he couldn't finish. "I didn't know you could." And then nothing. Just air. For a long time I wondered what the rest of that sentence was going to be. Now I don't think it matters. What matters is that the answer was always there, in the garage, in the cold. In 6 years of mornings I chose to show up anyway. Nobody handed me that. I built it the only way anything real ever gets built. Slowly, without applause, and mostly alone. There's something I've come to believe about how life actually works, not in a mystical way, but in a plain, observable way. What you practice in private eventually becomes visible in public. I wasn't painting to prove anything. I wasn't painting to get back at anyone. I was painting because I had to. Because my mother taught me that the thing inside you that wants to make something will find a way out whether you help it or not. But the consequence of doing that work honestly, consistently, for years, the consequence of refusing to put the brushes away just because someone told me it wasn't worth anything, was real. It showed up in a room on the Upper East Side with a price tag and a couple standing in front of it not moving. That's how it works. Not as punishment, not as reward in any cosmic sense, just as the natural result of what you choose to do with your time when no one is watching. My daughter asked me how I know what color to mix. I told her, you look at what you're seeing and then you look at what you've got and you try to get them closer to each other. You're never going to match it exactly. You're just trying to get closer. I wasn't only talking about paint. I think she knew that. There's a kind of intelligence that has nothing to do with degrees or credentials. It's the intelligence of paying attention, of looking hard at the thing in front of you, of being honest about the gap between what you made and what you meant to make, and going back in the next day to try again. That's what kept me in the garage when it would have been easier to stop. Not stubbornness exactly. Something quieter. The understanding that getting better is a process, and a process requires time, and time requires you to keep going even when the results aren't there yet. And underneath all of it, under the technique and the persistence and the years, there has to be something honest. You can't fake your way to a painting that makes a stranger stand still for 6 minutes with a glass of wine in her hand. Either you made something true or you didn't. I think the reason that creek painting worked was because I made it without any strategy. I made it because I loved the memory it came from. That's the thing no one can dismiss, no matter how many times they try. My daughter has her own brush now. She comes on weekends and she sits in the corner and she watches, and sometimes she asks questions and sometimes she just paints badly, and that's fine. That's exactly where it starts. I am not in a hurry, neither is she. We have time and we are using it, and that is enough.